Monday morning edition of Hot Mic rolls on here. Overreaction Monday is perfect way to sum it up from what happened this past weekend across FCS, which means we bring in Sam Herder from Hero Sports, BetMGM, who joins us each and every Monday in this time slot to overreact, or maybe that's more me, to things that happened this weekend. The highlight game, obviously, Sam, was in Brookings on Saturday night. South Dakota State fends off South Dakota and wins in overtime, and a great game, fun game. It felt a lot like the game in Fargo the week prior, where the Coyotes seemingly had numerous chances. The Jacks scuffled a bit, found a way, much like the Bison did against them. What did you take away from the game Saturday?
Yeah, there were a lot of similarities where, the winning team felt like, they probably could have won by a little bit more comfortably than the losing team was sitting there, whether it's USD this week or South Dakota State last week, sitting there saying, if we would have done this one thing, we would have won. And I tweeted out at some points in the fourth quarter, basically saying whoever loses this game is going to have a long list of reasons of why they should have won. And that was before fumbles and turnovers and missed field goals. And so just a crazy game. I think it shows that, South Dakota, even though they lost, they showed that they were on the same level as South Dakota State. And South Dakota State obviously showed they're on the same level last week as North Dakota State. I still like Montana State. And so just big picture, I think we now have 4 teams maybe on that upper tier, all on the same footing. And then UC Davis, we'll see about them. But I didn't knock South Dakota back at all, after losing this game. And really, I was for a bit in the fourth quarter, I was pretty convinced that South Dakota was going to win
the game.
And so in my mind, as a voter, I'm going, how far am I going to drop South Dakota State back, once they lose 2 games in a row? So just a crazy game, but the Jacks figure out a way to win it at the end.
Yeah, that, to me, South Dakota had its chance. We just saw the really odd halfback pass play they did late in the game, which, again, sometimes teams just get too cute. You're running, you're having success. I don't understand that. But then Angel Johnson fumbles and they get the touchdown return, and basically it's a gift 7 that they just gave up. So maybe the football gods evened it out there. I just thought South Dakota played just really oddly. They had a chance to win that football game and didn't do it. That was odd to me.
Yeah, I mean, a touchdown catch that was called back because of illegal formation. They ran another trick play that almost worked, but it was dropped by Galbraith, who's one of the best tight ends in the FCS. Had great field goal position at the end there, 3rd and short, and backup quarterback drops a snap, and that knocks them back a few yards. They missed the field goal. It's just, again, just a long list of reasons of why USD could have won that game. But at the end of the day, I mean, we've talked about this with NDSU and whether it was the UIW semifinal game or Montana State last year. It's just, there's so many reasons for the other team to win, but at the end of the day, like, some teams made the losing play, the other team made the winning play. And I think sometimes in games like this, South Dakota State is, used to winning big games that they're just, like you said, maybe the football gods or the bounce of the ball or just some things happen in some teams' favor. And for this week, at least, it was the Jacks that I think even Jimmy Rogers post game, in some instances, we got lucky here, a little bit. And sometimes you need some luck to win these type of games.
All right, so through these 2 games now, evaluate South Dakota State for me. Where do you think the Jacks are heading into the final 4 games of the season?
Well, I think defensively, South Dakota State, has a good argument to be the best defense in the FCS alongside North Dakota State. And so I think just defensively where the Jacks are at, they're going to win a lot of games just with that defense. And they really shut down South Dakota for the most part. I know the Yotes popped some big plays and missed on some big plays as well, but I think the Jacks defensively are looking really, really strong. Offensively, I thought, the passing game looked much better. I thought Gronowski had some throws that made you go, okay, this is why he was viewed as the top quote unquote small school draft prospect at the quarterback position, because some of his throws he made down the field were really, really impressive. And I thought Gronowski had a great game overall with his arm and his legs. There were some drops in there as well, or else his numbers would have looked even better. So I thought the passing game looked much improved this week. The running game for South Dakota State, especially in run blocking, I thought was lacking this week and last week. On the other side of the coin, South Dakota's defense is really good. NDSU's front 7 and defense as a whole is really good. So you're not going to run for 300 yards against these type of defenses, but not quite the push in the rushing game for South Dakota State. So I think the Jacks still could easily win, the national title. I think South Dakota, is right on par there. I think NDSU has a nice pathway in the national title game. Same with Montana State. And so I think South Dakota State is still really good. But, even though they were preseason number one for South Dakota State, like no one thought that the South Dakota State was going to be as good as last year. Like even their own fans said, okay, we're not going to be as good as last year. We might win the national title, but we're not going to be good as last year's squad. And so I think we're seeing that now.
The thing to me, they just seem a little off. They're still really good. And I said that last Monday when we did this segment. Like, Gronowski he's still good, but just not as what he was. Defensively, Tucker Large was back in this game for the Jacks, so they add back one of the best in FCS. And I'm with Jack defensively, look all right. Offensively, they just seem a little off to me, Sam, and I can't put my finger on it. Maybe the Jacks can't put their finger on it either.
Yeah, I think they're close to, kind of breaking loose here. And I thought last week against NDSU, you could question some of the play calling. I thought this week the play calling was fine. I think it was more of execution stuff where whether there was promising drives that got called back or there's a good play dialed up and they just missed, or, the running back has to make one guy miss and it's open field after that, but, he gets tackled by shoestrings or, in the open field. So I think they're close to really clicking. And, it's one of those things where, like, at this point in the season, sometimes you are where you are. And I think that applies to some teams, but at other times, like, sometimes things just click.
Yep.
And then they just start to roll. And we saw that, not to compare to NDSU again, but I mean, last year, NDSU's defense wasn't really playing well until the last 2 or 3 weeks of the regular season. And then we kind of thought NDSU's defense, they are what they are, but then things just clicked and they really started to roll. And you still get that sense that South Dakota State is close, but at the same time, we're in week 10 now.
Right.
And, maybe it's just, they're just one of those offenses that are good at times, and then some other times not as good, and they'll just face inconsistency all year. I don't know. We'll have to see, but I think they have potential to be much better offensively than what they've shown.
All right, so let me do this because we're going to have the FCS playoff rankings are going to come out on Wednesday. The only one we're going to get are the top 10. If the Bison win out, be 11-1. Montana State wins out, they're 12-0. Jacks win out, they're 10-2 with a non-Division I win, however you want to phrase that. Yeah. South Dakota, if the Bison were to win out, USD would finish at 8-3 because remember they lost one game because the game against Portland State didn't count, and they have the non-Division I game. Where does USD get seated in that conversation before we get to the other three in your estimation?
Yeah, that's why in my bracketology I have both South Dakota and UC Davis, who are currently ranked in the top 5. I have them dropping back, a little bit just because, I at the time I thought they were going to have a couple more losses coming, and one has, already came against South Dakota State. And so I think with the Yotes, I still think they would be a top 8 seed if they won the rest of their games outside of the NDSU game, because they would have, up to 8 wins there, 2 ranked wins. Southern Illinois has since dropped, but they would have, in this scenario, beaten UND, who I think is still going to be ranked by that point. And so I think that could still get them a first round bye and a top 8 seed because, quality losses, however you want to, shake it out. But I mean, if you have 2 losses and they're both to South Dakota State and North Dakota State, like that's not going to drop you too far compared to, just UND losing to Youngstown State,
right,
for example. And so I still think they would be a top 8 seed,
okay,
but the quality wins would be not super, super strong. I mean, UND would be USD's best win, but, and I think you could have like Mercer and SEMO, if they went out, kind of jump ahead there a little bit. So I think that last game against NDSU for the Yotes could be big if they were able to get that one.
Monstrous for both teams if it plays out the way we think it could. Going down the stretch. Now, let me get to UND here because they lose to Youngstown State, and it's going to be a head scratcher. It's going to reinforce what people in Grand Forks say, the narrative out of Fargo, but it's just they can't win on the road. That's a game you can't lose to a team that had won 2 games, Sam, and UND did. And now we were talking off air. Their stretch here, this is where now they got to go to Terre Haute this week. They should win, but again, put that in quotation marks. But they have South Dakota and South Dakota State in Grand Forks, and then that game at the back at Illinois State. They got to go 3-1, I would think, right? Because I don't think 7-5 is going to get them in.
Yeah, this loss really sets UND back because last week at this time I had UND in the playoffs, finishing 8-4.
Yeah.
Losing those two games against the South Dakota teams, but
Yep.
then winning the rest. And now that does put the pressure on to beat one of the South Dakota teams, and you get both of them at home, so that can work in your favor. At the same time, South Dakota State is fighting for a top 3 seed, and South Dakota is still at that point a week before NDSU is still in the discussion for a top 4 seed if South Dakota wins the rest of their games from here. And so you would expect a sharp performance by South Dakota and South Dakota State going to the Alara Center. And then that game for UND at Illinois State,
Oh boy,
that could be a win and in for both teams, just record wise. You win that game and you're you could potentially seal your spot in the playoffs there. But I think at 7-5, if UND was to lose to both South Dakota teams and finish 7-5, that's kind of like 6-5 in previous years where it can get you in, but it's pretty rare. 7 wins. You have a big win over Montana, who's potentially could be a top 16 seed that could maybe get UND in, but it just depends on the rest of the bubble. I think you're feeling really comfortable if you finish 7-5, 7-4 versus the FCS. You're squarely on the bubble there, and UND would have to hope that that UND or that Montana win would carry a lot of weights. We'd also have another ranked win, assuming Illinois State is still ranked at that point. But 7 wins is just not the same 7 wins as in previous years.
And here's Illinois State, and the Bison dusted them. They got blown out by Missouri State. But Sam, there's a pathway for them. They could win their last 4 and be 9-3, and we're talking about them as I would think a 9-10 seed, right?
Yeah, I think so. I don't know if they would have great wins. The Southern Illinois win is ranked at the time, but they won't have any wins over teams.
No, that's the thing.
Ranked teams, or I guess UND would be ranked at that point. Yeah. So, I dropped Illinois State for a little bit out of my top 25 after that Missouri State.
As did I.
2 blowout losses in 3 weeks, and you kind of go, they're kind of stumbling here and not looking great, but all of a sudden they stretched together some wins. They barely beat Murray State, and so you really wonder how good Illinois State is. But at the same time, overall record-wise, it's probably still good enough to be ranked. So I put them back in, and a pretty favorable finish to this season, where they could hit potentially 9 wins. So Illinois State, that probably wouldn't get them a top 8 seed just because they would be lacking those quality wins overall. But I think the Redbirds are starting to round into shape here as far as looking like a playoff team.
And this is what Illinois State has left. They host Youngstown, they go to Northern Iowa, they go to Indiana State, and host UND. At the worst, that sets up, much like last year, the final week of the regular season, Illinois State at UND was a win and in for whoever won. It could be that way again in normal, the final week of the regular season.
Yeah, and I think if, just as we're trying to figure out the resumes on the spot here, I think if Illinois State does win their next 3 games and they're at 8 wins already,
they're in.
And then UND beats them and UND does finish 7-5, like how do you leave out a 7-5 UND team when they just beat an 8-win Illinois State team? And so maybe UND, as we're talking about this, maybe they can get in at 7-5, assuming they lose both games to the South Dakota teams at home. So I don't know. It's all conjecture and trying to project ahead, but I think you need to beat the teams you're supposed to beat. Yes. And I think with UND losing to Youngstown State, that obviously doesn't eliminate them, but it makes these games even more must-wins for the Fighting Hawks moving forward.
The rest of the top 10, Mercer messed around for Western Carolina. They came back and won. Anything else that stood out to you from this past weekend for one of those top 10, top 12 teams that was Mercer to me was the most, I won't say shaky. They came back and won, but boy, if they suffered another loss, that would have really hurt.
Yeah, Mercer is interesting because that loss to Samford, really just kind of sticks out like a sore thumb. You're like, is this really a top 10 team? I mean, you lost pretty big to Samford, even though there was like 4 turnovers by Mercer in that game that led to 28 points, and Samford scored like 2 defensive touchdowns in the 4th quarter. So maybe that was more of an anomaly for Mercer, and they turned around and got a huge ranked win. And if you're going by ranked wins at the time of the game, that's now 3 ranked wins for Mercer, and they're sitting at 7-1 right now. They have the rest of their tough SoCon games coming at home, and so they could go. It'd be 10-1 versus the FCS. They have an Alabama game in there as well, so that's not going to go well. But 10-1 versus the FCS, it could be up to 4 ranked wins at the time, because I think Mercer still plays ETSU. Like that's a pretty good resume. They could jump into a top 4 seed, and they could be competing for that top 4 seed with SEMO, who just barely beat Gardner-Webb.
Yep.
So you go, okay, SEMO's undefeated versus the FCS. They beat Southern Illinois, and that was kind of when SIU was starting to get injured a little bit, but it was a ranked win at the time. They beat UT Martin. UT Martin has been in and out of the top 25, but just this last weekend they barely beat Gardner-Webb. So you're looking at SEMO and you're going, okay, they're ranked number 6, but are they the 6th best team in the country? I don't know. They almost had an FBS win, which would have helped them. So I don't know. It's weird because trying to project the seeds, South Dakota and UC Davis kind of take a step back because we project a couple of losses, even though right now they're ranked ahead of SEMO and Mercer. And so seeding could be pretty difficult this year for the committee.
Before we roll here, we'll get to your highlight games in a second. Give us 30 seconds on Rhode Island. Is Rhode Island for real? Could they win? Could they win the CAA?
I think they could, and Rhode Island has been a team that's been on the bubble for the last few years.
Yeah.
Has always had that questionable loss somewhere in there. And, this year they don't have that questionable loss. Now they have one ranked win at the time, New Hampshire. New Hampshire has since bowed out, but some of the wins, like they barely beat Campbell, they barely beat Long Island. Yeah. I think Hampton was a double overtime game. So it's just, I don't know, like they're undefeated versus the FCS, but some of their wins that's not the most impressive win. So they could end up being a top 8 seed. Are they going to make a run to the quarterfinals or semifinals like UAlbany? Probably not, but at the end of the day, they keep on winning, and so they could slowly move their way up the rankings.
And the thing is, Sam, because there's 83 teams in that league, they don't play Villanova and they don't play Richmond. They're the other 2 good teams in the league, so they could get to potentially 10 or 11 wins.
Yeah, and I just don't know how the committee is going to handle the CAA because on one hand you could say, well, the CAA has an advantage because they're going to have a bunch of 7, 8, 9-win teams because you don't play half of the teams in your conference. On the other side, it could come back to hurt the CAA because you could have Rhode Island, who's undefeated versus the FCS and doesn't have any wins over teams that are currently ranked, or Richmond, has a really great record, but they only have 1 ranked win, and so how does that stack up against the rest of the FCS? And so that's where and the CAA has a good record against non-conference opponents, but a lot of those wins are against Patriot League and NEC games. There are some wins over SoCon teams in there, but some of those SoCon teams have since dropped off, like Wofford. So I don't know. The CAA is really difficult to figure out.
All right, give us your highlight games we got coming up here for Week 10.
Yeah, it's a bit of a lighter slate. I think we were only going to have 1 ranked matchup. That's ETSU going to Mercer. Chattanooga also goes to Western Carolina. I don't know if Western Carolina is still going to be ranked or not. They might drop out, but those are 2 pretty signature games out of the SoCon. And then going to the Big Sky, Montana State goes to Eastern Washington. Really interested in this one because Eastern Washington is not good record-wise, but they've pushed some of the better teams in the Big Sky, so they're better than their record. And Montana State is looking good, but they have to go on the road. The red turf can be difficult. And then the last one is UT Martin going to Tennessee State. We'll see if the Big South OVC is a 2-bid league. I don't know if the Valley gets 5 teams in. I don't know if the Big Sky gets 5 teams in. That could open the door for a team like UT Martin, who has 8, 9 wins. They have an FBS win, one of the more forgettable FBS wins because it was Kennesaw State. But hey, I mean, you'll put that on your resume and you'll take it and run. And Tennessee State, I mean, NDSU clobbered Tennessee State, but Tennessee State's now ranked, and so that win has aged well for the Bison. And so if you're NDSU, you're probably rooting for Tennessee State to win this one. So that's another interesting one. Again, a bit of a 1 or 2 ranked matchup this upcoming week, but we'll continue to kind of form the playoff picture into shape here. You're the man. Appreciate the time as always. We'll talk to you next Monday. Okay. Okay, sounds good. Thank you. Sam Herder, Hero Sports, joining us each and every Monday to break down what happened in FCS football. We'll break. We come back. We'll wrap up hour 1. Jeff Kolpak on deck. Lots to chat about on the Bison football team after their win at Murray State. Hot Mike rolls on this Overreaction Monday. We're back after this.